My name is Miller Files. I have spent years walking through other people's worst nights, and I have learned something that never makes it into the headlines. A city does not break all at once. It double-checks a lock, in the way a mother keeps a lamp on in the hallway, in the way a couple stops sleeping with the window open, because the breeze no longer feels harmless. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was loud by daylight and uneasy by night. People talked about the freeways, the heat, the crime that came with big city life. But what happened next was different. This was not a robbery wave you could map by street corners. This was a private invasion that followed people into the one room where they believed they were safe. In the early reports, the cases looked scattered. A break-in here, an assault there, a killing that felt personal, even when the victim did not know the attacker. Detectives in different jurisdictions tried to do what they always do. They treated each scene as its own story. They interviewed the surviving witnesses, they pulled prints, they checked pawn shops, they looked for the usual suspects who drifted through burglary and violence. It worked for ordinary crime. It did not work for what was coming. The first true warning sign was not a nickname on television. It was the method. Someone was entering homes at night through windows and side doors, sometimes by removing a screen, sometimes by forcing a lock, sometimes by farting the soft spot in a house that the owner never imagined could be used against them. When you study enough burglary scenes, you start seeing choices. A burglar who wants money will move fast and avoid bedrooms. A predator moves toward bedrooms because control is the prize. What made this offender terrifying was not only what he did once inside, it was that he did it across distance, as if the city itself was his hunting ground. One night it might be a quiet street miles from downtown. Another night it might be a different county entirely. The geography told us something important. He did not fear travel. He did not fear crossing jurisdiction lines. He understood, even if only by instinct, that the seams between agencies could become hiding places. I want to pause here because this is where people misunderstand investigations like this. They imagine a mastermind leaving riddles. The reality is usually uglier and simpler. A predator like this survives because he is inconsistent in the ways the public notices, while remaining consistent in the ways investigators can use. The weapon might change. The victim profile might look broad. The scenes might feel chaotic. But underneath, the pattern can still be there. The entry points, the timing, the behavior that says this person has done it before and will do it again. In one early case, evidence that looked ordinary later became precious. A screen removed from a window, surfaces touched in the hurry of entry. Those are the places where you can find fingerprints, not always, not cleanly, not with a guarantee, but sometimes. In my work, I call those chances. And in a manhunt, chances are a currency you cannot waste. As the incidents continued, fear spread faster than facts. People compared notes in grocery store lines. Radios stayed on late. Police dispatchers took calls from residents who had never called the police in their lives. There were sightings, rumors, false alarms, 1,000 shadows wearing the same face. That is what a serial spree does. It turns a community into a nervous system. Every creak becomes a signal. The news wanted a single story, one monster, one motive, one timeline. But law enforcement had to deal with what the files actually showed. Multiple scenes, multiple victims, multiple towns. Each scene demanded meticulous work, and each new crime stole resources from the last one. In that pressure, mistakes can happen. Evidence can be contaminated. Leads can be pursued too long or dismissed too quickly, and yet This is where good investigators learn discipline. You do not chase fear, you chase facts. The offender's early success created a dangerous illusion that he was unstoppable. That is the trap of public panic. It makes an attacker look larger than life. But I have never met a human being who could move through the world without leaving something behind, a footprint, a print, a witness who saw a silhouette, a habit he repeats because it feels safe to him. In the months before the name Night Stalker became common, detectives were already doing the work that would later matter most. They were collecting evidence that did not yet have a suspect attached. They were building a silent library of details, waiting for the day when one piece would match a record, a photograph, a file in a cabinet somewhere. It is slow, thankless labor. It is also how darkness gets identified. By the end of this first chapter, Los Angeles was no longer just a city living with crime. It was a city learning a new kind of fear. Not the fear of a street corner, the fear of a bedroom door. And once that fear takes hold, the investigation becomes more than a hunt for a man. It becomes a fight for the idea that a home can still be a refuge. In the next episode, I will take you inside the noise, where scattered cases begin to pull toward a single thread, and where a small, almost mundane detail starts to connect scenes that should never have belonged to the same story. My name is Miller Files, and if you have ever tried to listen to a city in panic, you know what it sounds like. It sounds like 100 radios talking at once. It sounds like dispatch lines that never stop ringing. It sounds like rumors traveling faster than patrol cars. That is the environment where a predator thrives, because panic creates static, and static hides footsteps. In the second phase of this case, the attacks began to feel like a storm system moving across Southern California. Each new report carried familiar elements, but never in a way that made the offender easy to predict. A house entered while the occupants slept, a sudden confrontation in the dark, property taken as if to prove the offender could do whatever he wanted. In some scenes, the home looked ransacked, drawers pulled out, rooms disturbed, a message written in disorder rather than words. This is where investigators had to separate two kinds of details. There are details that shock and details that connect. Shock makes headlines. Connection makes arrests. Connection often begins with the entry. Windows where screens were removed, sliding doors where locks were manipulated, side entrances that were convenient because of poor lighting or fences that blocked a neighbor's view. When you line up those methods across multiple scenes, you start seeing a preference. The offender was not choosing entry points at random. He was choosing the points that let him be unseen, and he was repeating those choices because they worked. Then came another kind of detail, a quiet one that lives low to the ground. The impression of a shoe. A shoe print is not a name, but it is a signature of movement. It tells you how someone stepped where they paused, what surfaces they touched without thinking. In several scenes, the investigators documented shoe impressions that appeared consistent in pattern and size. Sometimes they were found near a window, sometimes in a hallway, sometimes in a bedroom area, which told us the offender was not skirting the most intimate parts of the home. He was moving through them with confidence. When you have multiple agencies working separate cases, a connecting detail like that becomes a bridge. It lets you argue that these are not isolated crimes. It lets you pool information. It lets you justify a joint task force, shared briefings, shared evidence standards, but it also creates a new risk. Once you tell the world you have a signature, the offender can change shoes. I remember reading how the pressure of public safety sometimes collided with investigative strategy. Leaders wanted to reassure residents. Media wanted specifics. The public wanted to know what to look for. And yet, every specific detail is a double-edged tool. It can help a citizen recognize danger, but it can also help the offender recognize what law enforcement is watching. In a case driven by forensic crumbs, you protect your crumbs. Inside the investigative files, you can feel the push and pull, calls for more patrols, requests for resources, meetings about how to coordinate across jurisdictions, debates about whether to release certain details. It is not glamorous. It is paperwork, phone calls, maps, and a growing sense of urgency that sits like a weight in the chest. Amid all that, witnesses became both essential and fragile. In night attacks, memory is distorted by fear. People remember a shape, a voice, a smell, a silhouette. They describe hair, eyes, clothing, but darkness is a poor photographer. Still, when you collect enough witness accounts, you can sometimes triangulate. Not a perfect face, but a direction. Not certainty, but probability. This is also when community behavior changes the crime itself. Some homeowners began sleeping with lights on. Others purchased dogs. Some neighborhoods formed informal watch routines. That can reduce opportunity, but it can also push an offender to shift locations. The pattern can stretch and move. Investigators have to adapt without losing the thread. As the case intensified, the nickname Night Stalker began to circulate in the public sphere. I dislike nicknames because they turn a criminal into a character. They invite myth, but I understand why they happen. People need a label for their fear. They need a word they can say out loud. And once the label exists, it travels, and it changes the tone of every conversation. For investigators, the label was irrelevant. The offender still had to be a person with habits and vulnerabilities. He still had to eat, sleep, travel, and make mistakes. The question was how to turn connecting details into a door that opened onto a real identity. By the end of this chapter, the thread was tighter. Entry methods were being compared. Shoe impressions were being cataloged. Evidence was being preserved with the hope that technology and databases could someday do what human comparison could not. The city was still drowning in noise, but the investigators had begun to hear a rhythm inside it. In the next episode, I will show you how that rhythm met a machine, how fingerprints moved from dusty evidence envelopes into a system that could speak the one word every task force needed most, a name. My name is Miller Files. There is a moment in every major manhunt when the case stops feeling like a collection of scenes and starts feeling like a single organism. The files breathe together, the calls line up. The patterns stop being theory and start becoming a map. In this case, that moment was forensic. For months, investigators had been doing unglamorous work, lifting latent prints from surfaces that may or may not hold them, photographing impressions, bagging and tagging items that looked ordinary, documenting entry points with the patience of someone building a house one brick at a time. The public rarely sees this stage because it does not produce a dramatic headline. It produces a quiet archive. But an archive is power when the right tool arrives. Fingerprint identification is one of the coldest languages in law enforcement. It does not care about rumors. It does not care about panic. It cares about ridge detail. It cares about points of similarity. It cares about whether a mark left in haste can be matched to a record created years earlier in some other context, a petty arrest, a minor crime, a routine booking. When the investigative teams turned to automated fingerprint comparison systems, the case accelerated. The basic idea is simple. A machine can search faster than any human can. It can compare a latent print to countless records and return the possibility that two hands, separated by time and location, are the same. When the match comes back, it does not end the case. It changes it. Suddenly, you have a name, and a name lets you build a biography. A name lets you pull prior records. A name lets you find photographs and addresses and associates. A name lets you turn an invisible offender into a physical target. The name in this case was Richard Ramirez. Once that identity surfaced, investigators had to move carefully and quickly at the same time. Carefully, because a premature mistake could tip him off and drive him deeper into hiding or push him to commit another attack in desperation. Quickly, because every hour mattered while a predator remained free. This is also where the relationship between law enforcement and media becomes complicated. The public needed warnings. They needed to protect themselves. They needed to recognize a suspect if they saw him. But investigators also needed to preserve the integrity of the search and the evidence. There were debates about what to release, when to release it, and how much detail to include. In the background, every agency understood the same truth. If the suspect realized how close the net was, he could change his behavior overnight. While the name traveled through investigative channels, the task force began the work of confirmation. Fingerprints can connect scenes. So can shoe impressions, witness descriptions, and timelines. The goal was not to rely on one piece. The goal was to stack pieces until the weight of the case could not be moved. And then there was the human side, the part that never fits neatly in a database. The fear in survivors, the anger in neighborhoods, the strain on officers working long nights, returning home to their own families, locking their own doors, feeling the same unease as the public, but carrying the additional burden of responsibility. In my notes, I wrote that this phase felt like holding your breath. The case was close enough to touch, but not yet secured. In those days, the suspect was not just a face on a bulletin. He was a moving risk. He could be on a bus. He could be walking through a neighborhood. He could be scanning windows. That is what a manhunt does to a city. It forces everyone to imagine the offender as present because he might be. The strategy at this stage is to tighten the net without making a spectacle that warns the target. Surveillance, stakeouts, coordination with patrol units, quiet alerts, quiet checks, quiet readiness. It is not cinematic. It is methodical. Then the public face of the hunt arrived, a photograph, a description, a clear message to residents to be alert. Once the image is out, the case leaves the hands of professionals and enters the bloodstream of the city. That is both a blessing and a danger. In the next episode, I will take you through the days when the search moved from labs and briefing rooms into the streets, and how a city that had been terrorized for months recognized the man they feared and almost tore him apart before the justice system could claim him. My name is Miller Files. There is a point in a manhunt when the suspect stops being a theory and becomes a face that anyone might see. That moment changes everything. Patrol officers see the world differently. Citizens scan crowds. Shopkeepers look twice at strangers. A city turns into a network of eyes. When the image of Richard Ramirez entered public circulation, the hunt widened beyond law enforcement. People recognized that they had been living under a shadow, and now the shadow had a shape. That knowledge does not calm a community. It ignites it. What followed was a volatile mix of fear and confidence. Fear because the suspect was still free. Confidence because residents believed the nightmare could finally end if the right person was spotted. This is where caution becomes crucial, because public energy can solve a case, but it can also create chaos that destroys evidence, endangers innocence, or turns an arrest into a riot. In the final days of August 1985, that energy erupted. Ramirez was recognized in East Los Angeles. The recognition was not a gentle thing. It was immediate, instinctive, and furious. People chased him. They cornered him. They struck him. The city that had been hunted for months became the hunter. Law enforcement arrived into a scene that every officer fears. A suspect surrounded by an angry crowd. The job becomes two jobs at once. You must take the suspect into custody, and you must keep him alive long enough for the justice system to work. If he dies in the street, you lose the chance to connect him to every scene. You lose the chance to recover information. You lose the chance for a verdict that families can hold on to. You also risk turning public fear into public lawlessness. Ramirez was taken into custody, and the immediate wave of terror began to recede. But an arrest is not closure. It is the beginning of proof. In the days that followed, evidence had to be organized into a structure strong enough to survive court. Investigators revisited scenes through the lens of a named suspect. Laboratory work intensified. Comparisons were made. Timelines were refined. Witnesses were asked to identify carefully under procedures designed to reduce contamination of memory. Every link mattered. I want you to understand the emotional contradiction here. The city was relieved, but investigators were still on edge. A man can be arrested and still not be the right man. A case can feel solved and still collapse if the evidence is weak. That is why professionals do not celebrate early. They build. In my review of this case, I was struck by how the smallest things became the strongest things. A fingerprint lifted months earlier, finally given meaning by a database match. A shoe impression documented in a hallway, now placed alongside other impressions to support the narrative of a single offender. Entry methods that seemed like common burglary, now recognized as a consistent technique across multiple crimes. Public narratives tend to reduce these moments into a single dramatic capture. But justice is rarely a single moment. It is a chain. If any link breaks, the whole thing can fall. In the next and final episode, I will take you into the courtroom world where the city's fear becomes testimony, where forensic details become language for a jury, and where the aftermath forces a question that remains long after the headlines fade. What does a community do with the memory of a man who walked through its nights? My name is Miller Files. In a courtroom, the night does not feel like night. The lights are bright. The air is controlled. The language is formal. And yet every person in the room carries something from the darkness that brought them there. This is where the story of the Night Stalker had to be translated, not into headlines, not into fear, but into proof. The prosecution's task in a case like this is to take a sprawling set of crimes and show coherence, to show that the same person entered homes in the night, used similar methods, left similar traces, and could be tied to specific scenes through forensic evidence and reliable testimony. The defense, as expected, would look for fractures. They would argue that panic had shaped perception. That media pressure had pushed agencies to focus on one man. That separate crimes had been unfairly bundled into one narrative. This is why forensic evidence matters so much. A fingerprint does not panic. A documented impression does not respond to television. A chain of custody record does not change because a city is afraid. These are the anchors that keep a case from drifting into storytelling. But anchors alone do not heal what happened. Survivors still had to speak. Families still had to hear details they never wanted to know. Investigators still had to revisit scenes in their minds, sometimes for years. The court could produce a verdict, but it could not return the ordinary nights that were stolen. When the legal process delivered its outcome, it brought a sense of finality in one dimension. A man was held accountable in the language of the state. Sentences were pronounced. The system recorded its judgment. For many residents, it felt like the city could exhale. And then the slower aftermath began. The aftermath is not one event. It is a shift in behavior that lingers. It is the way people install stronger locks. It is the way neighborhoods change their routines. It is the way parents teach children to check windows. It is also the way fear can remain in a body, even when the threat is gone, because the body remembers the months of vigilance. For law enforcement, the aftermath includes lessons that become policy: better coordination across jurisdictions, better sharing of forensic information, better awareness of how a single offender can exploit administrative boundaries, better discipline in managing what is released to the public, balancing community safety with investigative advantage. These lessons were not abstract. They were paid for in sleepless nights and broken lives. For the media, the aftermath is a question about naming, about myth-making, about whether a nickname feeds a criminal legacy. I believe it can. I believe we should remember victims by their names more than we remember offenders by their monikers. But I also know that history is imperfect, and people remember stories. The best we can do is tell the story with responsibility, without spectacle, without turning brutality into entertainment. So what is the real conclusion of this case? It is that a city can be terrorized by one man moving through the night, but a city can also respond with method and cooperation. It is that forensic science, when combined with persistent investigative work, can turn a shadow into a suspect. It is that communities, when pushed to the edge, can become powerful, but must be guided back toward law, because justice is not vengeance. It is proof, procedure, and accountability. I am Miller Files. I have read the reports, traced the patterns, and listened to the echoes in the testimonies. And if you take one thing from this documentary, let it be this: darkness survives on confusion. It loses when people refuse to look away, and when they keep the smallest details safe until those details can speak. The Night Stalker case is remembered as a nightmare. I remember it as a lesson written on window screens, on shoe impressions, on fingerprint cards, and on the stubborn belief that even in a city of millions, the truth can still find a name.